Typically, we ignore the tier 1 guys, to start them anyway. I will just say how nice it is to be able to put Tyreek Hill back where he belongs as a tier 1 option. Obviously, excited to rank Jaylen Waddle later in the video. But also with Cooper Kupp, we've had a lot of rumors regarding that maybe this guy is going to get traded. Maybe he is a Minnesota Viking. I mean, that's really where the main rumors are coming from, which is hilarious because they are playing the Vikings this Thursday. But regardless, play everybody in tier 1. Going down to tier 2, Stefon Diggs was disappointing this past week. Obviously, no Nico Collins. You'd assume Diggs is the alpha wide receiver 1 here in Houston. And that kind of does hold true here against the Green Bay Packers. The issue is CJ Stroud does not hit 100 passing yards in the game. So Diggs lets down this game against the Indianapolis Colts. You actually have an implied team total of 26 points. Now, of course, we actually saw the Texans play the Colts earlier this year, and that was a game in which Joe Mixon had, I want to say, 30 plus carries. So probably expecting the Texans to try to run the ball. Now, going over to Malik Nabers, I would love to put Nabers in tier 1, but why we've been anti-Nabers, why I've been saying to sell Nabers for Chase earlier in the season, Jefferson later in the season when the man was wide receiver 1 in fantasy, is it's a garbage offense. You see that play out this past week. And going into week 8, looking at sportsbook projections right now, they are currently putting the New York Giants against the Pittsburgh Steelers as the worst offense in the NFL with an implied team total of 15.5 points. Now, Malik Nabers remains an elite talent. Malik Nabers remains somebody that you're going to have to start every single week just based off of target volume. The man's averaging 11, 12 targets a game. He himself is incredible. It's just a brutal matchup as well as a brutal offense, which is why Malik Nabers will be a tier 2 option rather than a tier 1 option. Garrett Wilson, Devontae Adams will be back-to-back here. Against New England, sportsbooks are actually projecting the Jets to have a pretty big bounce back. I mean, the spread on this game is freaking insane. You have an implied team total of 24 points. I understand that, yes, they just got embarrassed. And yes, Devontae Adams was extremely disappointing with his first game as a Jet. But it was his first game, right? Realistically speaking, what are you expecting? He should expand his role going into the future. And going right back to this, currently the Jets are favored by a touchdown in this contest against the New England Patriots. So I do think that this is a very safe spot to play your Jets or at least the top 2 receivers here. Amari Cooper will be much higher in our rankings this week than he was last week. Amari Cooper only played like 30-40% of the snaps his first week in Buffalo, which is kind of what the expectation was, right? You're going up against the Tennessee Titans. That was the largest spread in any game last week. So understandably so, you were expecting that the Buffalo Bills really didn't have to push Amari's involvement when he had just barely been on this roster. I'm expecting Amari to get ramped up this week going up against the Seattle Seahawks. This actually should be a very high scoring game where you have an over-under of 47.5 points, where right now this is the 3rd highest projection of any game in the NFL. I'm going over to Brian Thomas Jr., number 1 buy low candidate for us last week. This is a receiver that's been printing 20-point performances. Yes, when it was his first game in London. Yes, when they had to go up against the Chicago Bears, he was a little bit disappointing. But here, going up against the Packers, you have an over-under of 49.5 points in this game. Should be the highest scoring game of the week. While at the same time, we should expect that the Jacksonville Jaguars are actually having to throw the ball in the second half. I know that may seem a little bit weird based off what we had last week with obviously the 15 straight rush attempts for this Jags offense in the second half. But last week, they got to go up against New England. This week, the Packers probably win this game. T. Higgins will be our next option going up against Philadelphia. 25-point implied team total. Right now, this game has an over-under of 47.5 points. I mean, this is a spot in which the Bengals know that they are going to have to throw the ball against Philly. We have seen that Cincy is willing to get into these shootouts. We have seen the Cincy defense completely collapse. Higgins is up, averaging almost 10 targets a game as well. I think it's a very comfortable spot. Play Higgins. Now, I cannot tell you how excited I am to play Jaylen Waddle this week. I benched him in the Flock League this past week. There had been a couple other weeks where I started him and was just utterly disappointed. We have not seen a single game with Jaylen Waddle with 10 or more fantasy points since week 1 this season. It's been a disastrous offense. It has been horrendous. Now, this matchup against the Arizona Cardinals, where we actually saw Justin Herbert go for over 300 passing yards, where we have an implied team total here for this Dolphins offense of almost 25 points, where the Dolphins are favored by 3 points in this game, is one where I think you have to start Tyreek, you have to start Waddle, and I don't think you hesitate to wait and see that Tua's 100% back to what he was previously. As long as Tua's playing, you start these receivers. Now, our next guy will be Jaden Reed. Obviously, he was very disappointing this past week against the Houston Texans, where you get a whopping 2 receptions for 10 receiving yards. And honestly, if you take a step backwards here with Jaden Reed, I think that you're going to continue to have some of these sporadic poor performances mixed in. The reason is the volume isn't there consistently to the point where this is a receiver that we can just expect a 10-point per game floor. Because if you go through and if you look at the targets that you've had in this offense, you have 6, 2, 6, 8, 6, 6, 4. And we have Romeo Doubs. We have Christian Watson. We have Dontavian Wicks. We have Tucker Kraft all seeing volume. Now, with all that being said, the Green Bay Packers do project out to be the second highest scoring offense in the NFL this week with an implied team total of 27 points. You're going up against Jacksonville, which has had a horrendous defense, where you actually have Drake May looking pretty damn good. So it is not only a spot where you have to start Jaden Reed, but I would actually in this matchup like to go with the Jaden Reed higher than 54.5 receiving yards. Now, if you go back and look at where he has hit this so far this season, it's only been in 3 weeks against Philly, against Minnesota, and against Los Angeles. However, if you're considering the fact that weeks 2 and 3, you actually played with Malik Willis, I think that we can throw those out of the sample. And this is going to be arguably one of the best matchups that we have seen all year for Reed. Of course, if you wanted to tail us on that pick, you can find that link to Underdog Fantasy in the description and comment section. Promo code FLOCK, you're going to get a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. Plus, you're going to be getting a free Matthew Stafford more than less than half a total yard for Thursday night pick. Now, of course, I am sitting here with a record of, I believe, 2 for 126 with our underdog recommendations so far this season. So you could say that I'm on fire. But let's move over to our next here. We're going to be looking at DJ Moore. DJ Moore sell high wide receiver for us a couple weeks back, primarily because obviously this is a situation in which you do have a considerable amount of target competition with both Keenan Allen as well as Rome Odunze. Sprinkle in a little Cole Kmet action. And at the same time, we were expecting that maybe this offense didn't have a ton of passing volume. However, it looks like we were wrong about that second statement, where Caleb Williams has really turned the corner. Plus, if you were looking at what we have with the projections against Washington, you have an implied team total of 23 points here for DJ Moore. I think that this is a spot in which you can go ahead and start him. Now, of course, since Keenan Allen's come back in, you have seen the targets go down for DJ Moore dramatically, where he was at 28 targets through the first 3 games this season, whereas over the past 3 weeks, he's only been at 19, but still should be a better offense with Caleb continuing to improve. Devonta Smith will be our next option. Going up against Cincinnati, more likely than not, you are actually going to have to see Jalen Hurts throw the ball, where this past week, off the top of the dome, I think that you had 45 rush attempts in this Eagles offense in comparison to something like 15 pass attempts. Absurd. So yes, it's going to look ugly in that kind of environment. But I mean, if we go back to the first 3 weeks and look at the largest sample of what we've had from Devonta Smith's career, I mean, at least the first 3 weeks here, 15 points, 20 points, then 15 points getting knocked out in the third quarter. I think you can be excited about Smith as a high floor wide receiver too, especially in a game environment against Cincinnati, where the Eagles are going to have to put points up on the board if they want to keep up. Our next guy will be Zay Flowers. Obviously, with Flowers, going to have to monitor the injury. I know y'all are very upset with us for having him as low as we did in our rankings last week. But fundamentally, the issue that you're going to have with Zay Flowers is the up and down target volume he's had this season. 10 targets, 11 targets, weeks 1 and 2. Weeks 3 and 4, 4 targets, 2 targets. Then 5 and 6, 12 targets, 9 targets. This past week, 1 target in a game where Lamar Jackson had 5 passing touchdowns. Zay Flowers gives you 4 points. Now, of course, you can say Mason, he gets banged up. He also played 71% of the snaps. So I don't know how much we can give him credit for that. And going up against Cleveland, this is probably a situation in which the Ravens are going to run the ball over and over and over again. So to be honest with you, when we update our rankings over on the site and when we update our rankings with the flex video later this week, I probably will have Zay Flowers lower than where he's at right now. Jackson Smith and Jigba will be our next option. With JSN, obviously you can tell with these rankings, I'm not expecting that DK Metcalf plays. You're going up against Buffalo. Now you do only have an implied team total of about 22 points. So it shouldn't be a great offense, but we have seen that in game environments in which you actually have the Seattle Seahawks trailing by a decent margin, they're willing to completely abandon the run and ask Geno Smith to drop back 50 plus times. Right now, the Bills are favored by 3 points in this game, so I think that's always in the range of outcomes here in this Seahawks offense. And based off the target volume, where Lockett has not had a single game with over 9 targets, and JSN has a game with 16, a game with 12, I think that JSN probably does have a little bit of a higher ceiling at this point. Marvin Harrison Jr. is going to be going up against Miami. Hasn't been a great spot for receivers so far this season. If you're looking at sportsbooks right now, you actually have the Cardinals projected as the 20th offense in the NFL with an implied team total about 21.75 points. Harrison has been very disappointing. The underlying issue with this is Kyler Murray is not having the passing volume. Now, Kyler Murray obviously is still okay from a fantasy football perspective himself because the guy's just going out there and running the ball over and over and over again. However, if you're looking at what we have with Kyler respectively, you have less than 200 passing yards in the vast majority of the games. Trey McBride obviously is still going to be seeing work here. So I think it's very difficult for me to come out here and make some strong argument for Marvin Harrison. Deontay Johnson will be our next option. Tough matchup against Denver. Denver's had the best or one of the best defenses in the NFL this season alongside the Minnesota Vikings. You have an implied team total of 17.5 points. So right now, sportsbooks are telling us that this Panthers offense will be one of the worst offenses in the NFL. The only other offenses that have an implied team total less than 20 points are the Titans, where I'm not starting either of their receivers, the Browns, and maybe you can go with Judy, the Pats, maybe you can go with Demario Douglas, the Raiders, maybe you can go with Jacoby Myers, the Saints, maybe you can go with Olave, and the Giants, where obviously Malik Nabers is a little bit of an outlier. But typically, these receivers in horrible projected offenses, we want to be pivoting away from. But Deontay has given you a floor with the target volume. George Pickens will be our next name going up against the Giants. The issue that you have is the Steelers are favored by about 5 points. I don't necessarily know if we should expect that Russ is going to give you a total of 37 points scored in Pittsburgh every single week going into the future. Obviously, the snap rate actually takes a tick up for George Pickens this past week, up to 79%. Pickens sees a season high 22 fantasy points, his first game with 20 fantasy points so far this season. And I do want to reiterate what we were saying last week. I don't know if Justin Fields is bad for the Steelers offense in comparison to Russ, but I do know that Fields would be worse for the pass catchers for Najee Harris because the production that Fields provides is actually more so going to be geared towards the rushing yards as well as him taking the own rushing touchdowns. So he does monopolize a lot of the points where Russell Wilson simply doesn't. Now, dropping down to our next tier, obviously it's very difficult to rank Juwan Jennings. So we already know Brandon Ayuk's out for the year. Deebo Samuel hospitalized on Monday. This will be a situation in which I'm going to need to consistently tinker with the rankings, and maybe Jennings is going to be moving up, especially with George Kittle banged up here as well. Maybe Jennings moves down if Deebo Samuel is somehow able to play. All I know is if I had to choose a receiver here, the guy that I'm going with is Jennings over Ricky Pearsall. I hope I'm wrong. I drafted a lot of Ricky Pearsall in underdog drafts. I have Ricky Pearsall in the flock league. But realistically speaking, Jennings had 46 points back in week 3 in a game with no Deebo Samuel and with no George Kittle. So I think I should be a little more excited about Jennings. Addison will be our next play. Thursday night game, going to play the Los Angeles Rams. Right now, the Minnesota Vikings are actually sitting here with an implied team total of about 25.5 points. They are 3-point favorites in this game as well. Obviously, the main thing to be on the lookout for is TJ Hawkinson going to play? If Hawkinson plays, Addison's probably a little bit less exciting. If Hawkinson misses, obviously Addison would be higher in the target totem pole. Tank Dell will be our next option. Everything screams that Tank Dell should be higher than this in these rankings. I mean, it was a very easy spot to take the fewer than 67 yards on Underdog last week. But realistically this week, you have an implied team total of 26 points. Sportsbooks are telling us that the Texans should be a top 5 offense in the NFL. You have no Nico Collins. Dell's had the target volume. Like over the past 2 weeks, you have 13 targets, but the issue is it's very difficult to tell you to start Tank Dell when he's coming off the goose egg. Now, going over to Terry McLaurin, obviously this ranking has a lot to do not only with the matchup, but also a lot to do with who's going to be at quarterback. We had Terry McLaurin ranked as a top 10 wide receiver last week in a phenomenal matchup against the Carolina Panthers and in a game which Jaden Daniels was going to be playing. The expectations here is that you have no Jaden Daniels, and this is one of the worst matchups you could ask for going up against a very good Chicago Bears defense. The only teams that sportsbooks are projecting to be a worse offense than the Commanders this week are the Panthers, the Titans, the Browns, the Patriots, the Raiders, the Saints, the Giants, and I do think more likely than not, Washington probably tries to run the ball a ton here. Now, Xavier Worthy will be our next name. Obviously, with Worthy, he's been very inconsistent. This past week, you only get the 5.5 fantasy points, while at the same time, Mahomes hasn't had any passing volume. Mahomes has more interceptions than touchdowns. This is a Chiefs team that wants to run the ball over and over and over again. However, Xavier Worthy does see a career-high 8 targets. Xavier Worthy is in an offense with no Juju Smith-Schuster, no Rashee Rice, and no Hollywood Brown. So presumably, Worthy is the only guy here alongside Travis Kelce. You're going up against the Raiders, who have completely given up. The Chiefs, at this point, are sitting here as 9.5 point favorites, which obviously the assumption is they probably go through and run the ball consistently. But I do think you could always play Worthy, hope for the big touchdown. Tyler Lockett will probably rise in these rankings. I think Lockett does have probably a higher floor than a lot of the other players around him here. My thing is, I just don't necessarily know if we've seen the ceiling from Lockett so far this season, where, I mean, we've had a total of 7 games. We've seen a bunch of these games where Geno Smith has a 50, 60 pass attempts. And even in that environment, I mean, the best game that we've had from Lockett, he's sitting here with 16.5 fantasy points. So it's not the easiest situation in the world to rank him the first game with no DK Metcalf. Obviously, my expectation is it's a much better spot with no Metcalf than it would be if Metcalf were to play. Going over to our next name, we're going to be looking at Darnell Mooney. Mooney up and down, up and down, up and down. A very low floor, very high ceiling. Kind of understand that's what you are signing up for. In this matchup in particular, going up against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, it is interesting. I expected the Atlanta Falcons to open up as heavy favorites in this game, but y'all know I'm the first person to admit I'm an idiot. I don't know anything. Sportsbooks know a lot more than I do. And they actually opened this up with the Atlanta Falcons as 2.5 point dogs to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers with no Godwin and no Evans. Atlanta only has an implied team total of 21.5 points. So we do have Mooney ranked lower this week than we did last week, but this is just a much lower expectation for what you have with this Falcons offense. Chris Olave will be our next name. Olave is just in a horrible spot going up against the Chargers, while at the same time, I mean, you have no Derek Carr. Now, clearly, if Derek Carr were to play, Olave would be significantly higher in our rankings. It is just extremely hard to project that to happen. This is a Chargers defense that just absolutely shut down Marvin Harrison Jr. And again, similar to what we were talking about with not wanting to start Bob Means last week, you don't want to start receivers in garbage offenses. And the only team projected worse than the Saints this week are currently the New York Giants. Ladd McConkey will be our next option. It's fine. I mean, with Ladd, I still expect that he is the wide receiver 1 in Los Angeles. I may end up having to start him in the Flock League. Last week, he doesn't give you a horrible performance. We actually see a career high 86% of the snaps played. He does also hit you with, 5 receptions, 46 receiving yards. Not horrible. But the issue that I have with Ladd McConkey is like, okay, well, Justin Herbert had 350 passing yards in that game. Like, if you're getting 350 passing yards from Herbert in a game with no Johnston and in a game with no Chark, and you only have 46 receiving yards for Ladd, realistically speaking, how excited about Ladd can you be? Christian Kirk will be our next name. Honestly, Christian Kirk may even be too high here. Since Evan Ingram's come back in, I mean, the receiving volume has plummeted. Only 9 targets over the past 2 weeks. Gives you the stinker against New England. The only saving grace that you have for Christian Kirk is this is a spot where the Jags are probably going to have to throw the ball a ton, and it should be a higher scoring game in general. Keenan Allen will be our next player. Now, I understand, obviously, Keenan Allen coming off a 21-point performance, right? Keenan Allen looked great right before the bye. I mean, Caleb Williams looks like he's crushing. But if you look at the underlying target volume over the past 3 weeks, you have 3, 6, and 5 targets. So it's nice when you see the 2 receiving touchdowns, but this is 2 receiving touchdowns off of 14 targets. That type of efficiency is not going to remain. The season high for receiving yards for Keenan so far this year is only 41. I do want to give him his flowers, though. It's a good matchup. Caleb looks like he's improving, so you can start him if you need to. Jalen McMillan is a wide receiver that I probably am going to put in a fab bid in the Flock League for, kind of hoping that I can pick him up. I'm expecting him to be the guy over Sterling Shepard. Maybe I'm wrong in saying this. Maybe I need to go with the old boring vet rather than the younger, quote unquote, exciting rookie. However, with that being said, he did have 8 targets. I think he more so profiles to be that Chris Godwin mold than what you have with Sterling Shepard. So I am planning on going with McMillan. I'm probably not super excited about it. I'm more excited about picking him up for the long term, seeing what happens against Atlanta, and then potentially playing him the next week. But I'm very surprised to see, and I honestly would maybe expect this to change, that you do have an implied team total currently at 24 points for this Bucs offense. So sportsbooks are still giving the Bucs a decent amount of credit here. Going over to our next spot, we are going to be looking at what we have from Romeo Doubs. With Romeo Doubs, this is a player in which you're kind of touchdown or bust. Good news, bad news. Good news is you're in a great offense. Bad news is the target volume's not consistently there. And good news is it's a great matchup against the Jacksonville Jaguars. Realistically, I think we could move these Jags guys up. We're going to have Jerry Jeudy as our next play. I want to make sure that Jameis is actually the starter. But obviously, if Jameis is the starter, expectations are that Jerry Jeudy is the wide receiver 1 in this offense. It's not the best matchup against Baltimore. You only have an implied team total of 17.5 points. But you have no Amari, and maybe the passing volume can be there. Dontavian Wicks, Christian Watson will be our next 2 names. If you're looking at the snap rates, it is much lower than what you have with Romeo Doubs. So realistically speaking, when we continue to tinker with these rankings as the week goes on, what I'm probably going to be doing is I'm going to be moving Romeo Doubs up these ranks. I think Doubs should probably be a receiver up in the Jennings tier, whereas Wicks and Watson should maybe even be a tier below this. I just kind of want to put a stamp on and say, with this Packers receiver room, all of them have the upside to pop off in a given week. Jaden Reed's the guy that you would start consistently based on him being the more efficient receiver over a large sample. If I had to choose from the secondary options, I'm going to be going Romeo Doubs. But in reality, I think you could look to bench all of them because they all do have very, very low floors. Our next 2 players will be Michael Pittman and Josh Downs. Extremely tough to be excited about either of the receivers in Indianapolis, where you go through and you look at Pittman past week, 5 targets. You look at Downs this past week, 3 targets. Anthony Richardson is just not conducive to passing volume. Anthony Richardson, at this point, maybe he can turn into a quarterback like Justin Fields, which would be a lot better than what he is right now. But realistically speaking, would that be a lot better for Downs? Would that be a lot better for Pittman? Probably not. There's just no upside for passing volume here. Going down to our next tier, I want to rate Courtland Sutton higher than this, to be honest. Courtland Sutton, you're sitting with an implied team total of 26 points. I'll probably go through, and to be honest, I'll probably rank Javonte Williams extremely aggressively this week, and a great matchup against Carolina, where I could not believe this when I saw this, but the Denver Broncos are 8.5 point favorites over Carolina. I think you have to start Javonte. Sutton is maybe more appealing this week than he has been previously. Obviously, he gave you the goose egg last week, though, which just looks brutal. Rome Odunze, definitely a lot more excited about this for Rome rest of season than we are right now. But obviously, at this moment, does look like he's behind DJ Moore. Looks like he's behind Keenan Allen. I think he can continue to improve, though. Jalen Tolbert, tough matchup. Really low total here with this Dallas Cowboys offense. You have an applied team total of only 21 points. Obviously, Lamb, dominant alpha. Shakir, I am expecting that. Amari expands his role. Sterling Shepard, I don't know. I mean, I would roster him, but I'm not going to start him this week. Wandale, this is statement ranking with Wandale Robinson. I have him in a bunch of underdog drafts, so I hope he does well. But if I add him in a regular redraft league, no way in hell I'm starting the second option in what projects to be the worst offense in the NFL. Demario Douglas is also statement ranking. I know a lot of people are going to be upset with this, but if you are looking at sportsbooks, which I'd make the argument that sportsbooks know more than I do, sportsbooks know more than you do, they are currently projecting out the New England Patriots with an implied team total of 17.25 points, only ahead of the Raiders, the Saints, and the Giants. And what we saw last week is New England willing to run a 5-man rotation at wide receiver. So you're looking at a really spread out offense in a situation in which you just simply don't have the upside in general. And then Keon Coleman will be our last guy here. Obviously, I have a lot of Keon Coleman in underdog drafts. Hope he continues to play well. But realistically speaking, I think Amari expands his role. I think KK can have a few more targets. And while I'm a lot more excited about Keon in the long term, I think starting him this week would be a little bit aggressive. But I really appreciate you and really hope I was able to help you out. Of course, if you wanted to lose with me, you can tell me over there on Underdog Fantasy to go higher than 54.5 receiving yards for Jaden Reed. You can find that link in the description and comment section. Promo code FLOCK is going to get with a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. Plus, you're going to be getting a free Matthew Stafford pick, more than less than half a total yard. And on top of that, you'll be getting a free team review in the live stream that we're doing every single night. Just make sure that you set up an account on flockfantasy.com with the same email address as your account on Underdog Fantasy. That way I know who to hook up with that free team review. But thank you again. I really do appreciate you and really hope we get to see you out with the live stream later tonight.